Good hello, people of the internet. I hope that you are having an absolutely fantastic day thus far, and hopefully my little video thing here won't make it a worse day. So, this is the latest episode, I suppose you could say, in what I have inexplicably called Talky Time, in which we will be discussing, in this particular case, we'll be discussing Greta Gaard's eco-feminist work, and also its connection to queer theory. So this is an informal discussion. It's not scripted. This is more based on several books, of which I will talk about, well, books and one essay. So first off, with Greta Gaard, a lot of her work is more so in academic articles, more so than full books. But we will be looking at 4 books, 3 of which are edited by her. 2 of which are edited by her, 1 of which is written by her, and 1 in which she contributed an essay. And then we'll be looking at an essay on its own. So, first we will be looking at Toward a Queer Ecofeminism, which is an article, so it's not a book, it's not very long. Then we will be looking at Ecofeminism, Woman, Animals, Nature, which is published in 1993. And this is an actual, book. And then we will look at ecofeminism, feminist interactions with other animals and the earth. Apologies. This is not actually by her, it's edited by Carol J. Adams and Laurie Gruen, but she did contribute an essay to it, which we want to discuss. Then we'll be looking at international perspectives in feminist ecocriticism, which was edited by Greta Gaard, Simon Estok, and Serpil Oppermann. So we'll be looking at them. And lastly, we'll be looking at Critical Ecofeminism, which is basically a collection of essays by her. All by her, though. And those are the ones that we are going to be looking at. So that should be fun. So let's start off with Toward a Queer Ecofeminism. Now, first off, ecofeminism itself is quite a multifaceted approach. It looks at a lot of things, and as this is just one aspect or one episode of a series on ecofeminism in general, there will be more discussions on it, so you'll be able to look at more of it. But she gives quite a good, distinct little summary in a sense. So this is in this. It's on the very first page of this particular essay. And she says, at the root of ecofeminism is the understanding that the many systems of oppression are mutually reinforcing. Building on the socialist feminist insight that racism, classism, and sexism are interconnected, ecofeminists recognized additional similarities between those forms of human oppression and the oppressive structures of speciesism and naturism. So, basically, racism, classism, sexism, speciesism, and naturism are all connected to each other. So, essentially, discrimination. Okay, well, people generally know what racism, classism, and sexism are, but speciesism and naturism are probably a little bit more unknown in comparison to those ones. And basically, they would be discrimination based on species and discrimination based on essentially nature. The fact that we don't care about animals or we don't care about certain things in nature. Although in the sense of speciesism, it is a distinction that is quite important to actually note when it comes to it, is that this is not anthropocentrism. Speciesism is not anthropocentrism, which is the idea that humans are the center of, the universe or whatever. And it's instead the idea that basically we see different species as being in a hierarchical relationship. So we see some animals as being superior to others. Obviously, the animal that we tend to see as superior to all others is the human animal, but we will do things like, for instance, we will see a dog as being more important than a rat. So it's discrimination based on species, not just saying that humans are superior to all others. It's saying that we see certain species as being special in relation to others. So that is actually what you're more so looking at. So this is a pretty good little sort of explanation in basic form of what ecofeminism is, but her point, because we have looked at ecofeminism before on this channel, there is a video dedicated just to ecofeminism, so you can look at that one for that, but she is specifically trying to connect ecofeminism and queer theory to essentially build a coalition, the word escaped me for a while, to build a coalition between the two and to try to incorporate them somewhat into one another so that they can be allies to one another. So the idea here is that a central concept in ecofeminism is the idea that dualistic thinking is a problem, that we have a way of separating certain things from each other, right? We have the idea of superiority of self versus inferiority of the other. So the self would be something like the dominant, right? So human versus animal, man versus woman, etc., etc. Now these are many, Val Plumwood basically had a whole list of these, explaining them, and she also has her own video, although I now do not remember whether I've already made it or if it's coming. Anyway, so this particular essay instead says, okay, yes, we've looked at that many, many times, right, this dualistic thinking. However, we do not often incorporate the idea of heteronormativity into this. So the idea that heterosexual sexuality and people are the norm and queer people are the other, right? So it's that superiority versus inferiority thing. And this essay is saying, listen, it should also incorporate queer identities into ecofeminism because, yes, there is this, man versus woman, human versus nature, etc., with one of them typically being considered to be above nature and the other closer to nature. So, right, humans are civilized. Nature is nature. Men are civilized. Women are more like nature. They're given to their emotions. They're blah, 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 blah. Those are like the ideas. Now, the same thing kind of happens here, but in reverse. It's essentially a contradiction, right? So, heterosexuality is perceived as natural, whereas queer identities are considered to be unnatural. So there's actually a contradiction there where natural is given preference over unnatural, although the other ones, it isn't, when you're saying man versus woman, you're not saying men are natural are unnatural and women are natural. We're saying women are closer to nature, men are more so detached and special. That kind of nonsense thinking. And it's the same idea with queer identities, but in reverse. So they are seen as the unnatural, wrong, whereas heterosexual is considered to be the correct one. So this, while it is a basically inversion of the usual dualistic perspective, it is still calling to attention this idea of nature versus civilization, when the one is all natural and it's good and it's reproductive, and the other one is unnatural and is giving into like savagery and whatever. For instance, this was used as justification for colonialism, right? You would say, oh, well, these certain people, who would in all likelihood be not white, had sexual practices that differed, which of course they were different culture, but the idea was that, oh, no, they are savages. Look how they treat sex, etc., etc. So they are unnatural, and so we need to, essentially, or in that particular sense, they're unnatural, which can then justify things like genocide. Either it's that, or once you have essentially subjugated, it then inverts again, with one being the closer to nature, more animal, right? The in racist ideology and racist language, non-white people are likened to animals. They are more natural, right? They are closer to nature. They're not civilized. That is the idea that ecofeminism specifically goes against, and queer theory and ecofeminism could come together in the sense, at least this is what Greta Gaard argues in this particular essay, that they could come together and work with one another to go against this idea. Now, the reason she looks at this in particular is to say, listen, we have this idea, right, that there's natural versus unnatural, correct? So heterosexuality in the sense is considered to be natural, and any kind of queer identity is not. Now, this was written in, or published at least, in 1997, so, but there tends to be a bit of a focus on homosexuality, but there are also some discussions of other queer identities, but you can just apply this more broadly. But she then notes this, that, listen, you might say, oh, it's unnatural, right? Certain things, it's unnatural, which is still a claim towards ecological things. So that's ecofeminism, claiming that there's a connection between sort of humans and nature and using it to oppress one, which in this particular case, the one that is unnatural. So, in this particular sense, she points out, listen, you have this idea that something like homosexuality is unnatural, but homosexuality has been noted in various animals, a lot of animals, and also the idea that there is a natural way to do sex is absolute nonsense. Similar to things with, say, gender, right? There are creatures that have a completely different way of approaching or biologically having sex. In this case, I mean sex and gender, not sexual intercourse. So something like, for instance, snails are not male or female. They are hermaphroditic creatures. So they are basically both. There are, of course, also creatures that are mostly one or the other. Clownfish are an interesting case in that particular area. So the idea that basically male and female is a fixed idea is nonsense. The idea that homosexuality is unnatural is nonsense. It occurs in animals, and are not animals what we always associate with nature. And so if you're saying, oh no, well, animals are unnatural, then what the hell is natural? So also, she points out other things, saying, well, listen, there are certain sexual practices that we would consider very, very unnatural. You know, for instance, if a man and a woman have sex, it would be very, very weird if immediately afterwards the woman started stabbing the man to death. Yet, that is what Black Widows do. So, what is natural in that sense? What if you've arbitrarily decided what natural sex is? Because there's always this idea that, oh no, right? Sex is for reproduction, right? That's what sex is for. It's for reproduction. It isn't for anything else. Well then, what about sex for pleasure? Which a lot of people have sex for pleasure. And if you claim, oh no, like sex is for reproduction, and you've ever used a condom, then your entire argument is completely null and void because you are a liar. In that particular sense. Also, an email just came through while I was speaking. So, thank you, email. Yes. And then there's also the idea that people would say something like, okay, well, of course, it's yes, some people, right, have sex for pleasure, but animals don't have sex for pleasure. That's only for reproduction. Of course, there are some animals that do have sex for pleasure, and also, of course, there are animals that engage in sexual activity during pregnancy, which we know you cannot, get pregnant when pregnant. There are some animals that can get pregnant by multiple partners, but once you're pregnant, you can't exactly sit there and be like, oh yes, I'm going to get pregnant again. That isn't how that works. So the idea that there's a natural sex is nonsense. So this is why she is trying to create a connection between ecofeminism and queer theory. And that's why this is called Toward a Queer Ecofeminism. Saying, listen, these two should be connected to each other. They have similar things. They are both concerned with a couple of things. And for instance, she specifically talks about queer identities, the erotic, right? And also things like race. Race is also part of this. As I said earlier, sexual practices of certain ethnicities and cultures has been used as justification for things like genocide. You can kill these people because they are unnatural. And then once you have controlled them, well then they are closer to nature, and so they are less intelligent than insert name of group. So that is basically this essay, right? Super, super fun. But this idea of queerness and essentially ideas of gender, sexuality, etc. will recur in more of her work. So let's move on to the next one, which is critical. It's not critical ecofeminism. Why did this open next? Ecofeminism, which was published in 1993. Get them right, young man. So this is basically an essay collection that she edited. However, she did contribute 2 essays to the collection. So we're going to be looking at both. Now, in this particular sense, she says, okay, listen. Now, in the previous essay, we've spoken about, merging of queer and eco-feminist ideas. Now here, she's saying, okay, listen, we need to also look at things like, say, animals. All right? So we need to learn how to bridge the gap between basically nature and humans. Now, she is specifically talking about woman in this particular sense, and we've spoken about ecofeminism many times, and there will be more videos after this talking about ecofeminism and those connections, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but she's basically talking about how this whole sort of movement developed, the ecofeminist movement, developed out of a variety of things. So peace movement, it is anti-pacifist. Labor movements, it is class conscious. Women's healthcare, it is a feminist study. It is anti-nuclear. It is environmental, and it is an animal rights thing. Now, in the next essay here that she writes, which is called Ecofeminism and Native American Cultures, Pushing the Limits of Cultural Imperialism, this is somewhat of an acknowledgement that ecofeminism has predominantly been white woman, and that cultures such as Native American cultures have a lot of the same concepts as ecofeminism. And so she is trying to say, listen, these ideas aren't new. These ideas, there is a connection between, us and nature. This isn't a new idea. And it is something that we need to take on board and look at properly. Right? And now, for instance, she says here, which is page 297, if ecofeminism opposes the domination of non-human nature, then ecofeminism must also oppose the killing of animals. Animals are inherent to this. Animals and nature are very important. The eco part of ecofeminism is obviously the ecology, which includes animals. So it's a holistic approach that looks at various things. And this essay essentially just does say, listen, we mustn't basically do cultural appropriation. We must incorporate the ideas of other cultures into our work and acknowledge that properly, listen, which is a big thing that she speaks about in a later book. You must listen to those other cultures and actually take it on board and do not basically see it as a form of cultural imperialism. It should not be that one group is the superior group, that ecofeminists are this brilliant group. No, they aren't. These ideas are not necessarily new. They just formulated them in a new way. And so we need to take that on board. Now, the next essay is in the book that was not edited by her, the one by Carol J. Adams and Laurie Gruen, which is Ecofeminism, Feminist Interactions with Other Animals and the Earth. Now, she contributed one essay to this called Toward New Eco-Masculinities, Eco-Genders, and Eco-Sexualities. Now, this isn't saying that this... I just immediately found it funny because there is a friend of mine who works in film, and he saw an indie film with people who claim ecosexuality, that they're essentially attracted sexually to nature. That is not what an ecosexuality is in this particular sense. So the idea of eco-masculinity, eco-feminism, eco-genders, and eco-sexualities is the idea that we need to move towards a new idea of things like masculinity especially. Femininity already has somewhat of a connection to nature. This has often been perceived as a bad thing. Women being closer to nature, therefore they are inferior because they're more like the animals because of emotion, can't control themselves, these kinds of discriminations and beliefs of certain people, which we looked at many times in ecofeminism stuff that we looked at before and will in the future. So I can look at that. But eco-masculinity, the idea that, listen, masculinity has often been about domination of nature, has often been about control, has often been about being assertive and essentially exploitation. It's about being dominant and winning. That's what masculinity is about. And this idea, she says, we need to embrace the idea of an eco-masculinity. To say, listen, we shouldn't look at it like that. We must move away from these kind of things because it's masculine, for instance, to eat meat. Meat is considered a very masculine thing. We need to move away from that. The idea that it's masculine to be dominant. We need to move away from the idea that things like consumerism are all around us, and we incorporate these things into our identity, and we need to try and move away from this and to connect ourselves more so with nature. So the idea of eco-genders and then eco-sexualities, which is also somewhat spiritually, in a sense, which is where I fall somewhat off it, because I don't much care for anything to do with spirituality, but the idea that there is essentially a connection between sexuality and nature, in some sense, and a connection, a spiritual connection, which is up to you to decide on what you think about that. It's not ready for me, but that's me. It is up to you whether you see things like sexual intercourse as something spiritual or not. But we're not going to get into that. So let's move on to the next book. This one is called International Perspectives in Feminist Ecocriticism. Now, when I first read this, my studies are mostly looking at the animal side of things, not so much the environmental side of things, but they do obviously intersect with one another. My focus just tends to be more on the animal side than the ecological side. I sort of misread the book title, and I thought it said International Perspectives in Ecofeminism, and it says Feminist Ecocriticism. Now, ecocriticism is not ecofeminism, but they are connected to each other, and as a matter of fact, there is, I think it actually might be this guy, Simon Estok. I think he said that ecocriticism is ecofeminism, basically. It has to be grounded in feminism, but yes, technically you could draw a distinction between the two. Now, she contributed one essay to this. She also did contribute part of the introduction, but that's just talking about, ecocriticism being feminist, pretty much. So, cool. But we're not going to look at that one. We're going to look at this other one, which is called Interdependence Day, a feminist eco-critical perspective on fireworks. Cool. So, if you know anything about animals, you know that animals do not like fireworks. They don't. They're scary. It's explosions in the sky. It isn't nice. Now, there's this idea that what humans want is more important than what animals need. Animals need to not be exposed to fireworks, but humans go, oh no, but I want fireworks because it makes pretty light in sky. Which is a very, very weak rationalization for fireworks. So as she says here, and this is a quote, page 254 in this book, when the public fireworks finally begin to whistle and explode in the night sky, few spectators notice the startled geese flying erratically across against the lights, the dogs breaking leashes and jumping fences to escape the explosive bangs and whistles, the infants and toddlers wailing and begging their parents to take them away while the parents insist they stay for the fun. So as you can see, this is obviously an immediate condemnation of fireworks. There isn't really anything much more to say in this. It's not theoretical, it's just saying, listen, fireworks are actually bad. And they're not bad just because they're scary to animals. They're bad for material reasons. They pollute the air, the water, and the soil. They are made of chemicals that you're then exploding in the sky. They're often used as weapons. Also, they're used as weapons against animals. There's a lot of animal abuse with fireworks, so that isn't great, obviously. They're also often made through child slavery, and there's also the potential to harm people who use them, especially like kids. I remember as a kid, I was told, because we had Guy Fawkes Night on our local beach, which then eventually ended up getting banned from the beach. I don't know when, but I haven't experienced Guy Fawkes in years, and I say good riddance because fireworks shouldn't exist. They're not a good thing. They are merely for the spectacle of the thing, and they don't serve any actual function. They are there purely for human, I don't know, enjoyment. They're bad. Fireworks are a bad thing. And as a kid, I remember being warned very, very specifically, be careful of fireworks, be careful of fireworks. There was, I don't know if this is a true story, but apparently a kid who held a firework for too long and it basically mashed up their hand badly. So she basically says, listen, is it worth it? Is the ephemeral joy of fireworks really, does that outweigh the negatives? And if you don't know what ephemeral means, something that starts and ends quickly, like it doesn't last, it's gone within moments. So that's that essay. Funsies. Now we look at the last book that we're going to be looking at, Critical Ecofeminism. Now this particular one is a collection of essays, actually all collected together, which is great. Some of these essays actually originally appeared in other ones. For instance, that one about eco-masculinities and stuff was in this book. But I didn't reread it because as soon as I noticed it was in here, I was like, oh, perfect. I don't have to reread that. Cool. So, Critical Ecofeminism. Now this one is just a collection of essays talking about various things. So we're going to look at these in brief. Now it's actually the second essay. The first essay was more so about environmentalism. And as I said, environmentalism and ecofeminism are closely connected to each other, but it's just not the area of ecofeminism that I have paid particular attention to, because my main area is in animals, not ecology. So, the second essay, which is called Plants and Animals, basically looks at the fact that there is also such a thing as plant studies, and saying, listen, there is a bit of a spanner in the works here for the idea of essentially ethical veganism. So the idea, right, that you are a vegan because it is the ethical thing to do, it is the right thing to do. A bit of a spanner in the works is the fact that plants may not be quite as unthinking as we thought they were. A couple of things, they give off volatile chemicals when attacked, which has been labeled as screaming. It does emit a sound that we can't hear. They do have some kind of a consciousness. They don't want to be eaten. There are, for instance, plants that will give off certain chemicals when they know they're being eaten to try to dissuade animals from eating them, which means they do not want to be eaten. It depends on what you want to define consciousness as. People, you see this a lot in animal studies. People try to define consciousness along very, very narrow grounds. To say, listen, consciousness is the ability to have rational thought, whatever. Basically trying to make it as human as possible and saying, like, animals aren't conscious either. But there is a certain kind of consciousness that plants have. So this really depends on what, it just throws a spanner in the works in terms of ethics. They are just so different from us, though. So, like, a lot of animals, we can kind of tell what they're thinking, depending on what the animal is. A lot of mammals, you can tell, not necessarily. We should not be anthropocentric. A point that she points out in another one of these essays is a picture of that one chimp that was shot into space. When it came back, the pictures of it, it had like a big smile on its face. That is not a smile. That is terror. That is sheer terror. That is not, humans associate a smile, a toothy smile, with being happy. That animal was terrified. And so we should not ascribe human characteristics onto animals unnecessarily. They are not the same as humans. They think differently to us. And plants are even more different to us than animals are. So we can't actually fully understand them. Now, there was one little point that I noted here, is that I do note somewhat of a distinction when it comes to fruit, as fruit is literally made to be consumed. Fruit is part of the reproductive process. A lot of fruit requires animals, it doesn't require animals to eat it, but it requires animals to, move the seeds and the pollen and stuff like that. And seeds are often inside. So what happens is a lot of animals will move, seeds around, which helps spread the plant seeds around. My dog is now barking outside. Thank you, Pippin. Lost my train of thought for a second. Yes, plants. So fruit are meant to be eaten because the actual seeds are often then spread through things like animal droppings, because they'll eat the whole fruit and then they poop out the seeds at other places, and the seeds aren't destroyed during the digestion process, and so they can be spread around. So fruits are essentially there to be eaten, not necessarily the way we eat them, because we don't eat them right. We'll chuck them and stuff, or we'll literally eat seeds, which seeds are not meant to be eaten in terms of like what is the actual purpose of a seed. A seed is there for reproductive purposes, but that's the way it is. But that's the only point that I would really make here. Yes, a lot of plants don't want to be eaten, and say root structures and stuff, they don't want to be eaten. That's like the lifeline of the plant. But things like fruit is literally made to be eaten. She does point out here, though, that listen, we have to eat something. So, and this is usually made as a justification for, oh no, well then you might as well eat meat if plants can also feel. But here's the thing. If you just eat plants, you are overall eating less plants. Because the animals that we eat plants, and they eat often significantly more than we do. So if we want to kill fewer plants overall, we should eat less meat. So it's, no matter what, it's still moving towards eating less meat. And she also points out that, listen, indigenous and Buddhist cultures and stuff like that have often had this association with treating all creatures as essentially living beings that are earth others that we should live with, and that we should not just have this kind of awful relationship that we currently have with them. And there's another email just came through. Thank you, email. Anyway, the next chapter is just called Milk. Quite simply, it's about, in case the title was a bit too vague, it's about milk. So, what is milk? We all know what milk is. Milk is a thing that is created by a lactating mother for the purpose of feeding its young. Now, when we think milk, we usually think cow milk. And we don't think of it in terms of feeding baby calves, but rather feeding humans. And not baby humans either. And I think another email is going to come through. I've tried to make it be quiet, and it won't be quiet. Just come through already. Now you're being slow. Okay. So we think of milk. There, it came through. I've actually just realized I don't know if those sounds are coming through on this, but I have a feeling they would be. So anyway, milk. We think of milk as a thing. Oh, we all have milk. Cow milk. But really, milk is not for us. Once you become an adult, you should not be having milk anymore. Milk is bad. Milk is actually not good for us. There's this idea that like milk is really, really good for you. It isn't. Milk is, first off, full of mammalian estrogen. So it's when the dog is barking again. So when people say things about, how soy milk and soy products are, sources of estrogenizing men, and it's feminizing men. As a matter of fact, oh my god, another email is going to come through. Why am I getting so many emails? Anyway, but actual milk, cow milk, does contain estrogen, unlike regular soy, which contains a phytoestrogen, which is basically a plant estrogen, and here's the kicker, plant estrogen is not the same as animal estrogen. They are different to each other. Anyway, that's a little estrogen chat. So, milk, first off, we shouldn't be drinking it, first of all. But now, this is not really what she's talking about here. She says, listen, milk is wrong. It's cruel. And she points out a couple things. We keep cows in a state of perpetual pregnancy and forced insemination, because here's the thing, and I'm sure you know this about, humans. You don't just produce milk. You need to get pregnant, or there could be a hormonal imbalance, but generally you need to be pregnant, right, to produce milk. the same is true of cows. Cows don't just make milk. Cows make milk because they have babies. So they are kept in a state of perpetual pregnancy until they die, pretty much. They're pumped full of growth hormones so that they can produce milk at an unhealthy rate. They produce too much milk. The machines that milk them, because humans don't milk cows, you have machines that do it because they're more efficient. These things also basically hurt them and can lead to various infections, which is why we also pump cows full of antibiotics so that they don't get sick. So those are all the things that we do to animals. So we're also, when we have the milk, we are drinking all sorts of lovely, lovely antibiotics and lovely, lovely growth hormones. So it is literally bad for us to drink milk. But that shouldn't be the main thing. The main thing I would say should be the fact that it's cruel. That's actually the most important thing. And here's the thing. These cows live 4 to 5 years rather than the 20 to 25 years that they are capable of living. So they are able to live much longer, and we do not allow them to live that long. Furthermore, calves are just taken away from the mothers at a young age, which obviously is a bad thing. You shouldn't be taking calves away from their mothers. That's literally taking a child away from its mother. Just because it's not a human doesn't mean it's special. Now, furthermore, the females who are taken away from them, they just go, okay, cool, we're going to force impregnate this one. And the males, well, they're kind of useless, so we're just going to make them into veal. And that is literally what they are used for. The males are used for veal, and the females are used for milk production. And she says here in a great little quote, she says, page 65, "Inside each glass of milk is the story of a nursing mother separated from her offspring." Fun. Now let's look at the next essay. Animals in space, which I kind of briefly mentioned before, the chimp that was shot into space. Now, she points out that for us, now the whole thing about space exploration is that we want to colonize space, which first off should bring some alarm bells, because colonization is not actually a good thing. It means that we want to exploit space, which isn't good. We shouldn't be exploiting space in general. But despite colonization of space basically being a bad thing, we still want to do it because, of course we do. We want to, save ourselves from global warming, so we need to do something. But the way in which we do it is often, not good, and we often harm animals in the process. So, for instance, the first bigger animal that was sent into space was famously Laika, the Soviet dog who was sent into space. Now, when Laika was sent up into space, it would be, I don't know, there tends to be this idea, oh no, she was sent into space. Don't think about it anymore. Because, this was before we figured out how to bring, spacecraft back into orbit. So she died. She died in space. She died alone in space. And the thing that we do with these animals is that animals which are used in space exploration and what have you tend to be captured and then confined and then used and then probably die and, don't have a great way of it in general. And we've kind of already looked at that thing which I said before about the whole, the chimp that we thought it was, oh, it's grinning, it's so happy. And then Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, she was like, listen, that isn't a grin. That's a terrified animal. That thing is so scared right now. So the idea that, oh, animals in space, oh, to get to space, we need some sacrifices. Yeah, well, you're sacrificing creatures that do not want to be sacrificed for your little colonization efforts. Now, the next one is called Climate Justice, and basically does just look at climate justice, that it needs to be informed by things like anti-racism, etc. I'm not really going to go into this one as much because, yeah, it's not as much of my focus, as my focus, as I said, is mostly on the animal side of it. But if you do want to learn more, it's good to read these kinds of things. There is a lot of ecological stuff in their work. So if you're interested in the ecological side, you should also check it out. And the last one is very, very short. It's just called Cli-Fi Narratives. And it's basically just saying, listen, we need to have more narratives that focus on climate issues. Because if you have more narratives that focus on climate issues, then you can actually make this more so a part of the public consciousness, and people can actually learn about it and know about it, and etc., etc. It's a good thing that we incorporate more aspects of our world into the stories that we tell. And so, yeah, that's pretty much all the stuff on Greta Gaard. Her stuff is great, and I'll definitely recommend checking it out. Yes. I don't think I really have anything else to say here, but her work is fantastic alongside all the others who we will obviously, be looking at still in the future and have looked at thus far. So there's still a lot to do, a lot to look at, lots and lots, everyone here and there. So yeah, I think we're going to end off there. If you enjoyed this, you can do all the usual, like, subscribe stuff if you want to learn more things. And also, if you want to check out any of my other stuff, you can just check out the description. And I believe that will be everything. So, I hope that you have a fantastic day, week, month ahead, and fare thee well.